Speaking on driving positive change in the post-pandemic creative economy is Anthony Sargent CBE, International Cultural Advisor, Leader, and Communicator. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's terrific to be invited here, and I'm just echoing what John Newbigin said earlier. This whole expo and this conference is an absolute triumph of vision over adversity. So it's wonderful to be here. After nearly 2 years, we need to remember what an extraordinary, exceptional period this last 2 years has been. 264 million cases of the pandemic, global in a way that even world wars, I'm sorry, I haven't got my, yes, thank you. Global in a way that even world wars haven't been global, impacted all aspects of our lives. In the UK, it's been the longest arts shutdown since 1642, when the Puritans closed the theatres for a long period. And the discontinuity has affected every element of our lives. Culture has been affected disproportionately, though, in this. In market terms, the cultural industries are very often discretionary spend. The cultural sector depends on people congregating. I mean, in periods of lockdown, that wasn't possible. CCS is a very fragile employment model. We heard earlier, something like a third of the people working in the sector are employed in semi-detached ways, not formal employment. And as if that weren't enough, currently we're not looking at one set of disruptions, but really four. There's the disruption of activity through the pandemic. There's the disruption of society through movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, threats to democracy, all the discomfort at present with different effects of colonization, disruption of all kinds of communication through the digital revolution and AI revolutions, and disruption of the whole world through the existential climate crisis. We also need to understand the scale of the global damage to the sector as a whole. Productions abandoned, tours cancelled, organizations destroyed, venues closed, lives overturned, and worse, across the whole of the cultural sector, all that really messed up our ability to plan. The complexity of the relations between cause and effect made mapping and responding to the crisis really difficult. And across the whole sector, we found it uncovered complex interdependencies between different kinds of cause and effect, which had effects on all aspects of our work and our behaviors during this terrible 2 years. There have been a huge volume of studies over the last 18 months, different metrics of damage, but they were all really backward-looking studies. They risk ignoring the other half of the experience of the last 2 years, which is where COVID changed behaviors in positive ways. It opened new doors, it created new opportunities for us, it enabled us to see all kinds of things in a fresh light. My global study, which is what's behind this, I'm trying to condense a very long study into 20 minutes, it looks at that positive half of the experience of the pandemic. So it's forward-looking, looking globally at where the lessons and opportunities lie, and the ways that the cultural sector might be positively impacted by COVID. I'm going to make many assertions in this talk without any evidence. For reasons of time, the evidence is in the study. The disruptions of the last 2 years pushed cultural leaders to improvise in all kinds of ways. Now, some of those won't outlast the life of the pandemic, but the purpose of my work is to look at the other ones, the changes that we may want to make permanent, that might alter the ways that we work in positive ways for the future. There's really 3 phases to this journey. In the very beginning, last March to August in 2020, people thought this wasn't going to last long, and they kept talking about being back to business as usual. This was supposed to begin to happen very quickly. Then in the period starting in September 2020, people could see it was going to last much longer. And they started to see positive things happening, new positive kinds of learning and opportunities. And people started to talk about a new normal, i.e. a new normal that might be better than the old normal. Now we're in a third phase, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. And this talk is really in 2 halves. The first half covers the story up until August last year. The second half covers what's happened since. So the first half of this, I'm going to talk about things that are looking inwards to how companies work. The first thing is we have become more comfortable with change, with the whole business of managing through a process of change. We've become used to it becoming the rule rather than the exception, to become agile about changing priorities, confident about ditching what we would call sacred cows, those things that are long past their sell-by date, and we know we ought to have said goodbye to. This has been an occasion when people could do that. We've also seen how old hierarchical kinds of leadership styles have been really badly adjusted to crisis leadership. We've seen the value of more inclusive leadership styles. In the last 2 years, we've seen more human emphases in the workplace, issues like belonging, like equity, respect, safety, all those issues that before the pandemic weren't so foregrounded as they've become since. And just as we've seen new approaches to leadership, we've also seen new approaches to management. We've seen the value of company cultures that are more organic and empathetic and better integrated. Problem solving is much, much easier when you have integrated company cultures. We've seen the liberating effect of escaping from those silos, either silos between departments within organizations or silos between organizations that were so dysfunctional. And as well as organizational lessons, there have been personal lessons. We've seen strong, near-universal valuing of community and kindness. During the pandemic, the word kind and kindness became so much more a part of our vocabulary than it was before. And we've seen a new emphasis on mental health. There was a survey in the UK a little while ago that showed that 1 in 4 adults felt that their mental stability was more fragile than it had been before the pandemic. When old ways of doing things became impossible during COVID, we became really skilled at developing new ways of doing things. We learned to develop more creative approaches to business strategy, recognizing that our narrow sense of the core of a business, which we assumed would never change, actually it does change. Traditional approaches have been largely built, traditional approaches to business strategy have been largely built on what I'd called linear trajectives. They assumed that the core identity of companies would rarely change. The way forward has to embrace something much more like complexity theory. The old approaches to business strategies can't help us in what we now think of as a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. The frequency and the pace of change are too fast, the complexity of the problems is too great, and the cultural context for the decisions we take has become much too sophisticated for those old methods. Risk, this isn't something particular to the pandemic, but it's underpinning our ability to respond rationally to the pandemic. Assessing and responding to risk depend on 2 things, data and rationality. And in this period of post-truth, of disinformation, of conspiracy theories, our confidence in objective data has been really seriously compromised. So our ability to apply rationality to data has itself been undermined. And that warps our ability to respond rationally to risks. Take the example of COVID vaccines. It's at least 10 times more likely that you will die from the disease of COVID than from the vaccine. But otherwise, rational people sincerely believe that the vaccines represent an unsafe risk. This isn't, as I say, a COVID-specific thing, but it's made dealing with COVID harder. Communications, there are many lessons for communications. The cultural sector has generally focused its communications around sales and product-oriented messages where we have all the answers. We've been going through a period when there wasn't any contact, there wasn't any product for most of the 2 years around which to communicate. So we've been giving wider messages around our businesses in fast-changing circumstances where we don't know everything. The last 2 years, and that's given us challenges, both of content and of tone. It's been a challenge, and we've seen it be a challenge for government through changing situations and the constantly changing advice that they've been receiving. Just this week, we've seen all that again with the Omicron variant. Looking around the world at all the lessons from the way that people have handled communications in the last 2 years, We've seen the importance of comfort and confidence in communications in a fast-changing and uncertain world. We've seen the importance of being proactive and specific and simple, of saying the same things to our different communities, of making sure that everybody in an organization delivers the same message and always telling the truth. There's a lengthy section of my study devoted to the online world, so I won't duplicate it here. But in spring 2020, when live culture largely disappeared, there was the overnight explosion of digital content. First putting existing content online, then more and more creating new kinds of online and virtual content. And in the last 2 years, that's allowed existing audiences to continue to enjoy culture when there wasn't any live culture available, but it's also engaged new audiences, especially during lockdown. A lot of them had different demographics, more family audiences were taking on the online offer. It's enabled organizations to communicate globally, not just to their local catchment. It's placed the arts within reach, and in many cases for the first time, with people who have access challenges, mental or physical access challenges. It's given them the arts, many of them for the first time. It's also triggered enormous digital upskilling within companies, enabling us to see long-term transformational potential of digital and the possibility of a whole new, rich world of hybrid culture emerging from all this. Those were the inward-looking things, but the outward-looking things, the crisis affected everybody, since every business was impacted by it. Faced with that challenge all over the world, and it's been very striking this, all kinds of new networks have sprung up across all the old divides, the traditional divides, across art forms, across divides of geography, scales, all kinds of groups of arts organizations who wouldn't have worked together had found themselves working together to try to find their way through the crisis of the last 2 years. And the benefits for that have been so clear in terms of a kind of tsunami of new kinds of knowledge and experience sharing. This is the longest discontinuity in the arts within living memory, actually for much longer than that. Arts organizations often close for a few months for refurbishment or for maintenance, but not the whole sector and not for 2 years. And it's dangerously easy to assume that the audiences that we're all eager to welcome back will be the same as the audiences that we left when the close down began. But they won't. They have themselves changed. They will need different things. They will want different things. And there's widespread evidence building up now of audiences wanting new, refreshed kinds of relationships with arts organizations. So they're wanting deeper relationships than just the old kind of transactions. And they also need much more physical reassurance than we expected in terms of coming back to the arts. Again, touring, I've covered this well in the study, I'll say it just quickly, but COVID, with all the disrupted international travel, wasn't the only thing that's caused us to rethink artistic touring. The online explosion and also the issues of climate change have made a lot of people think afresh about everything to do with how touring works. And in many parts of the performing arts, the old model was a kind of city-hopping model where people jumped from city to city, country to country, night by night. There's a lot of evidence that that's not the way people are going to be looking at touring in future. They're going to be looking at something that's much more to do with little residencies, that people land in places for longer and they have more organic relationships with the places they arrive. One of the biggest lessons of COVID has been the incredibly uneven comprehension of the cultural sector by governments around the world. Many of them haven't understood the structure of the industry, the employment structure of it. They haven't understood the volatility and the exposure of our revenue models. They haven't understood the international ecosystem of which national and local companies are a part. And so they haven't really understood, some of them, the real contribution that the culture sector could make to their communities. There's a really urgent need to address that, and to address that cohesively rather than individually. So that's how the picture looked last summer. So from the summer on, and this is after my report appeared, all the time it's clear that there's a binary split between the pandemic-specific changes, they will go away when the pandemic finally ends, and the things which have potential for embedding in our long-term culture. And that picture is developing right now, so I'm going to do a follow-up to my study sometime in the first quarter of next year, covering all this ground. But leadership, it's more and more clear that the kinds of leadership that worked more or less before the pandemic are not the kind of leaderships we want for the future. Working from home, it's become an extraordinarily live issue, really for communities all over the world. For some people, it was an easy and attractive thing to do. For others, it was very seriously and problematically challenging. And in lockdown in many countries, it was enforced, it was universal. Now there's a choice. So what will happen? Now there's a choice. After all the experience of COVID, there's a real body of evidence of a groundswell of people wanting to think afresh about how their working lives work, about a new kind of relationship with their work distinct from their life. In America, you probably will know this, in August alone, over 4 million people left their jobs. That's 3% of the workforce, voting with their feet in favor of things like wanting more flexible and more responsible work regimes, more availability of working away from their office bases, more inclusive company cultures. So far, it's been the biggest phenomenon in the United States, but all around the world, there is evidence that people are rethinking their priorities for their lives. Many surveys talk about people considering leaving their jobs, and in the creative and cultural sector, a lot of people have left their jobs, and interestingly, a lot of them have moved into very different kinds of work. They've moved out of the cultural sector altogether. In online terms, we saw overnight the explosion when there was no live culture. What will happen when live culture comes back? In the UK, there's some evidence that theatres are reducing their online as the live offer comes back. In the US, that's less true. But many organizations, even the ones that have scaled back their digital activities this autumn, they're still planning to expand their digital activities in future. And across the whole sector, there's an ongoing capacity building happening behind the scenes, digital capacity building. And already, so we're seeing in some places completely new levels of digital energy and creativity, opening completely new doors to fresh kinds of hybrid culture. Just now, we're seeing very different cultural markets, all of them recovering or trying to recover at different speeds. We're seeing audience nervousness about coming back to live culture, much more severe than we expected it. We need to assume that we'll continue to have reverses like the current Omicron variant. The recovery, we need to understand this. The recovery is not going to be easy, it's not going to be quick, and we're going to recover to a world that won't look like the pre-pandemic world. Governments, at the start of the pandemic, I said governments were very uneven in their understanding of the cultural sector. In the last 2 years, some of them have got to understand the sector better, some have not. After the pandemic, we really need all governments to really, really understand how the cultural sector works, what kind of support it needs, and what contribution it can then make. And then there's a new issue for governments. A lot of governments are missing a trick in not seeing the possible relationship between cultural policy and environmental policy, particularly when the cultural sector is one of the sectors which is most alive to the moral and practical issues of climate change. The dilemma, back to normal versus the new, better normals, it's alive right now. It's completely unresolved now. During lockdown, we have seen new ways of working that offered us new kinds of opportunity, but in the last 6 months, we've started to see the gravitational pull of old ways of working come back. I'm not going to talk in any detail about this, but there are, interestingly, an extraordinary number of completely unexpected and unimagined things coming out of the pandemic. In Britain, there are 250,000 stray cats in Britain on the streets, because in lockdown, nobody could get their cats neutered. And there are all these kind of things all around the world, and I will gather them together in the next stage of my study. So, where we are. Where we are now, the biggest and the most important global question that we face as an industry is the dilemma of the opportunities for change versus the gravitational pull of the past. That's the core challenge underlying everything else. It underlies all the other decisions we make wherever in the world we live. Will we be confident and adventurous, remembering and retaining all those inspiring discoveries that we've made in the last 2 years, community spirit, comfort with change, all the extraordinary things that have happened online? Or will we slither back into the old pre-COVID ways of living and working, from which the experience of COVID could offer us a route to escape? We know which we should do, we don't yet know which we will do. Thank you very much.